Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Eccles 2009 recording, where, as usual, I am going to provide a summary of the article as some scaffolding for how to consume an academic article like this. And then I'm going to transition to conclude the recording with some points or some features of the article that I particularly want to highlight for all of you. And then I'm going to wrap up the recording with just a couple of questions for you all to grapple with prior to coming to class on later in the week. And as I think I've said about every article so far, I want to emphasize both that this is personally one of my favorite articles of all time. I think that there are so many reasons why this is just such an excellent and such an impactful article. And I personally have probably read this article maybe 20 times over the years, and I've cited it countless times. And with that being said, even though I've read this article very, very frequently and used it in my own work, it's still really confusing. So I want to normalize that confusion for all of you, that every reading that we will complete in this class is going to be really challenging. And that's a sign that you're engaging with the content correctly and thoroughly. That's not a sign that you're missing something. Again, the point of us coming to class every week together is so that we can be confused together and to really push our thinking and push our understanding. So with that being said, I'm going to jump into the summary of Eccles 2009. And although this is definitely by no means a comprehensive summary, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail than I usually do, just because I think that with this article in particular, for a number of reasons, I think that a slightly more in-depth summary will really kind of facilitate our thinking, not just this week, but in weeks to come, since identity and the development of identity is such a central construct and set of questions that we are going to be exploring in this class. So with that being said, Dr. Eccles starts with presenting her overarching objective of the article. And specifically, in writing and publishing this article, Dr. Eccles attempted to summarize a motivational perspective on both identity and identity formation, and how she does so. So again, casting a motivational lens on the idea of identity as a construct and how identity develops in the first place. How she does so is by specifically drawing from a major theory of motivation that we haven't yet, I don't believe, discussed in this course, which she referred to in the article as expectancy value theory. And she and Dr. Alan Wigfield have since renamed it to be situated expectancy value theory. So that's the overarching objective, again, to summarize and to propose and to present a motivational perspective on identity and identity formation. How Dr. Eccles defines identity in this article is as a set of beliefs about who they are, who an individual is, or in other words, a set of beliefs about one's abilities, personality, and characteristics. So identity, according to Eccles, consists of a set of beliefs that we each have about ourselves, about our abilities, our personality, and our characteristics. And she characterizes these set of beliefs in terms of two basic self-perceptions. One, perceptions related to skills, characteristics, and competencies. How good am I at this? Can I do this? And two, perceptions related to our own personal values and goals. And an important component of that is how much do I value this given task or activity or domain? Why do I want to do this? Why don't I want to do this? So therefore, within situated expectancy value theory, And within this conceptualization of identity, there are two major components or psychological processes. Again, those perceptions related to our characteristics, our skills, and our degree of competence, and then also our perceptions related to our own personal values and goals. And Dr. Eccles focuses on identity as it relates to motivated action, which is directly and very intimately tied to those two sets of self-perceptions. Importantly, Dr. Eccles in this article, when breaking down further her conceptualization of identity, focuses on and distinguishes between two different types of identity. The first type is personal identity, or in other words, aspects of identity that serve the psychological function of making one feel unique. In other words, the quote, me self. That's what she refers to as personal identity. What makes me me? So in my case, what makes me Allison? What makes me unique from everybody else? Two is this idea of collective identity. That's the second type of identity that she distinguishes between and that she really kind of focuses on and casts a spotlight on within this article. Collective identity refers to the personally valued parts of the self, the personally valued parts of the self that serve to strengthen one's ties to highly valued social groups and relationships. So some really key examples that often, if not always, fall into this collective identity category are things like gender identity, racial or ethnic identity, religious identity, social class, structure, and family. Another example that I believe that Dr. Eccles doesn't explicitly mention, but I believe would fall into this category that you all have inspired me to think about, given how much this has come up in our discussions and in your reflections, is having a social identity related to a disability, for example. I think that this could potentially function or serve as a collective identity. I would be interested to hear what you all and also what Dr. Eccles thinks about that. So collective identity, the quote, we self. What are those personally valued parts of what makes me Allison that strengthens one's ties to either highly valued social groups and relationships? Next, another really important point, because I see this as very foundational to the entire article that Dr. Eccles makes, is she positions identity as a motivational construct. And directly related to that, she talks about the behavioral choices that we make, the decisions that we make as being the primary mechanism or means through which individuals enact their personal and collective or social identities. So basically what she's saying here, and again, I see this as being really foundational to her entire conceptualization of identity as she presents it within this article, the decisions that we end up making, and often these are really kind of crucial educational decisions, whether to enroll in an advanced level course in high school or to enroll in a general level course, whether to pursue higher education, which college to pursue, whether to declare a major in physics or in fine arts, let's say. All of those are examples, are just a few examples of behavioral choices. And Dr. Eccles argues that behavioral choices are how we enact, or in other words, we express both our personal and our collective identities. And so getting kind of more directly back to this idea of identity being a motivational construct, I mentioned that she, and throughout her career, has drawn from and has developed situated expectancy value theory, which is, of course, also a major component of this article, which reflects a very widely used, exceptional theory of motivation. Here I've pasted the simplified version of the figure that Dr. Eccles presents within the article. And this figure really highlights a lot of key tenets of situated expectancy value theory that are particularly relevant or salient to her article, and therefore the conceptualization of identity as it relates to motivated behavioral choice. So here in this section, Dr. Eccles provides a broad overview of the key tenets of SCVT, which I'm not going to go over in this article, but don't hesitate to let me know. I know that several of you are really interested in drawing from SCVT for your capstone projects. If you would like to chat with us further about the SCVT tenets, definitely don't hesitate to let us know. And that would be a great question to raise with Dr. Eccles as well. So here in the article, she describes these SCVT tenets with an emphasis on the identity lens. And at the risk of being redundant in this recording, I want to re-emphasize that a major connection to identity is the behavioral choices that learners make, which provide information that then informs the subsequent development of how we all view ourselves. And it gets back to that point that I made earlier about how Dr. Eccles, in her conceptualization of identity, really positions behavioral choices as a major way that we can enact our personal and or our collective identities. She also points out in this section that social experiences, along with, importantly, individuals' own interpretation and agentic selection, so seeking out their own experiences, provide the initial information on which individuals begin to form notions of their me and we selves. And over time, these behaviors that we select yields new information. So a really important bottom line to take away from this kind of broad conception of identity as a motivational construct is that, on the one hand, our behavioral choices are the primary means by which we enact our personal and collective identities. And then kind of in a circular reasoning isn't quite the right word, but in a circular fashion, I guess, those behavioral choices then provide us with more information about our me and our we selves, or in other words, our personal and our collective identities. And then we have social experiences based on those behavioral choices that we seek out, which kind of further solidifies our me and our we selves. So again, another important bottom line that is directly related to what I just said is that forming these different components of our identity, specifically our personal and our collective identities, and then attaching different values and importance to them, is a very fluid and dynamic process. I think that dynamic was the word I was looking for a couple of minutes ago in the article. It's a very dynamic and not at all sort of unidirectional process. The next part of the article casts a spotlight on that first set of self-perceptions, specifically related to competence beliefs, which one of which of those competence beliefs and grounded within situated expectancy value theory is referred to as expectancies for success. And in Dr. Eccles' conceptualization of identity, she positions and conceptualizes these expectancies for success. How well do I think I'm going to do? How successful do I feel like I'm going to be at this given activity, task within this subject domain? She positions this first set of self-perceptions, expectancies, as mediators of achievement-related choices. Mediators, so helping to explain that pathway to achievement-related choices. A very important point that I don't think is talked about enough within the literature that Dr. Eccles raises, that I believe I'm going to return to, if I'm remembering my notes correctly, a little bit later in this recording, is that Dr. Eccles talks about how successful somebody thinks that they're going to be, expectancies for success, as being mediators of achievement-related choices, That's really important on its own, but what's also really important to consider and to reflect on is the hierarchy of expectancies and and efficacy, excuse me. So in other words, not just how successful do I think that I'm going to be in physics, for example, but how successful do I think that I'm going to be in physics relative to social studies is a question that a student might ask themselves. And again, to as an aside, I have a sixth grader and I kind of see him engaging in real time in these exact kinds of questions. It's super cool to see the research come to life like right before your eyes. But anyway, that was a bit of an aside. I just had a bit of an aha moment as I was completing this recording. So I thought I would share it all with you. But getting back to the point of thinking about expectancies, let's say in physics, are really important, but also considering the hierarchy of expectancies and efficacy perceptions as they relate across domains as well, which is, I think, a really important point that Dr. Eccles raised within the article. Within this section, she also highlights various sources of expectancies. So in other words, how do people come to either believe that they're competent and that they will have a high likelihood of success on a given task, activity within a given domain? What are the sources of those expectancies? One of the first things that she highlights is both external and internal comparison processes, which, according to Dr. Eccles, and according to lots of other research as well, play an important role in developing expectancies for success and ability self-concepts. So for example, in terms of an external comparison process, something that becomes quite often, with many exceptions, of course, but much more salient and much more common in middle school are kind of enhanced competition and enhanced social comparisons between different students. That would be an example of an external comparison process. An internal comparison process, as the label implies, exists and occurs within the student. And what that means is that especially as students develop and they approach and transition into adolescence, they become much more skilled at making internal social comparisons. How well am I doing compared to my peers? How well do I feel like the student beside me is doing in this class compared to me? That's an example of an internal comparison process, which Dr. Eccles argues is also an important source of how students' expectancies for success and their self-efficacy, how those set of self-perceptions develop, which again is a key mediator or mechanism for ultimately fostering those achievement-related behavioral choices that I talked about earlier. Another important source is causal attributions. That gets back importantly to individuals' interpretation of a given event. So if an individual was successful, why was I successful? Was it due to luck? Or was it due to the fact that I worked really hard and I used really successful strategies? Or I am inherently good at, let's say, math. Those are all examples of very different causal attributions that will have important implications for informing an individual's expectancy for success and sense of efficacy. Also, another important set of attributions that a student makes is, why was I not successful? Was it due to bad luck? Was it due to unfair treatment? Was it because I didn't study all that hard and I procrastinated until the last minute? All key examples of causal attributions that have really crucial and distinct consequences for the expectancies for success that follow. Another important source that Dr. Eccles highlights within this section is social influences. I think that this is really of significant interest to a lot of you based on our conversations so far, and also the excellent reflections of yours that I've read over the past few weeks. Social influences. So some examples, this is of course not an exhaustive list of social influences, are socializers like parents, teachers, and peers, who all of those socializers either directly or indirectly tell individuals what they're good at or what they're not good at. And this connects directly back to our feedback conversation from last week, which I'll say a little bit more about, I believe, later in the recording. And then a final source that I'll highlight here that was talked about in the article is that we ourselves play a very agentic role in developing our expectancies for success and our sense of efficacy. Here's a perfect example. Our 9-year-old had a really excellent experience last year in 3rd grade math. Her teacher was wonderful overall, and her teacher absolutely loved math and kind of really saw Brooke's, I don't even want to say potential, but just really saw her skill, I guess, saw her in math. So Brooke ended up really loving math last year and really engaging in it. She loved it so much that she decided to sign herself up for extra math over the summer. So that quote, her brain did not get mushy. That's kind of a direct quote from our 9-year-old. This is a perfect example, in my opinion, about how individuals themselves play a very agentic role in developing their own expectancies for success, because that extra practice over the summer led Brooke to become extra confident going into 4th grade in math for her expectancies for success and her sense of efficacy. So that's, I think, a really good example of how we play our own really kind of agentic, as Dr. Eccles said, role in developing our own sense of competence. So an important bottom line of this section is that all of the above sources of information really feed into the identity formation process, specifically the me self. Who am I? What makes me unique? That sense of personal identity. Next in the article, Dr. Eccles talks about task values, that second component of self-perceptions, as motivators of achievement-related choices, as expectancies as mediators, task values as motivators. And there are 4 major task values subsumed within Eccles and Wigfield's and colleagues' situated expectancy value model. Utility value, interest or intrinsic value, I've heard it referred to as both ways, attainment value, and cost perceptions as well. I'm going to focus on the 2 task values that in this article, Dr. Eccles highlighted as being particularly relevant and salient for the identity piece. So in terms of attainment value, one thing that I really want to highlight is how Dr. Eccles, and then I'm going to return to this later, Dr. Eccles talked about in the past, she conceptualized attainment value as the needs and personal values that an activity or behavior of a task fulfills. The needs and the personal values that an activity or a behavior or a task fulfills. Today, she shared that she conceptualizes it, and by today I mean back in 2009 when this article was published. We can ask her, if you all are interested, whether her conceptualization has evolved further. But in this article, she conceptualized it more in terms of personal and collective identities. Personal and collective identities is much kind of closer aligned in her evolved conceptualization of attainment value. So this one dimension of task value, she's really thinking about it in terms of those personal and collective identities that Dr. Eccles had been talking about throughout the article. She then talks in terms of attainment value about how individuals develop an image of who they are and who they'd like to be. And the parts of the self-image that are really central or critical to how we define ourselves, our self-definition, we're going to place high value on that, which then is going to ultimately influence our achievement-related choices. So an important bottom line of the section where Dr. Eccles really reflects on attainment value and its intimate relation with personal and collective identity is that Dr. Eccles is arguing that personal and collective identities operate in ways that decrease the probability of making choices that ultimately lead us to engage in activities or roles that are perceived as really inconsistent with our central values and our identities. On the other hand, personal and collective identities increase the probability of engaging in roles and activities perceived as being consistent with one's definition of selves, or in other, or their self, in other words, their personal or collective identity. Put in a slightly different way, if there are aspects of our personal and collective identity that are really, really central to who we are and how we see ourselves, the probability that we're going to engage in activities that allow us to reflect those really central part of our identities is really high. If something is really peripheral, I'm trying to think of an example. This is a funny example that just kind of crossed my mind. But back when I was a teenager, and when I was in kind of childhood as well, I would go horseback riding quite a bit. I was really lucky to have been given that opportunity where I had lessons about once a week. And since then, I haven't gotten on a horse in I don't know how many years. I would be pretty unlikely to engage in that activity according to this model, and definitely I would agree with that based on my own assessment, because it's no longer really kind of central to my identity. Also based on fear, I would be scared to like get on a horse and go horseback riding at this point, but that's kind of beside the point. Bottom line is, things that are really kind of crucial and central to our personal and collective identities, that's going to increase our behavioral enactment or our behavioral pursuit of activities that allow us to reflect those things that are really central or core to our personal and collective identities. And related to cost, I'm just going to say a couple or highlight a couple of things that that Dr. Eccles included in this article. But cost perceptions is a really important motivation construct that Dr. Eccles argues, and I agree, is really centrally related to identity perceptions. And really at the heart of this construct is, what am I sacrificing? What am I giving up by engaging in this activity, this task, this domain? What am I giving up? And she kind of elaborates on that conception, or that conceptualization rather, by saying that cost can really be conceptualized as the loss of time and energy for other activities that may be more central to one's personal and collective identities. So I suspect that if I'm interpreting this correctly, one important reason why Dr. Eccles highlights cost as a particularly meaningful type of task value in terms of identity is that, as she said in the article, it can be thought of as, what am I giving up in terms of an opportunity to express aspects of my personal and collective identity that are especially salient to me? Going back to the silly horseback riding example, I might attach a fair amount of cost perception to it, especially at this point of my life, because there's these really core aspects of my personal and my collective identity that if I go horseback riding every Saturday, what opportunities am I giving up to instead express parts of my identity that are much more central, much more salient to me at this point in my life? So that's all that I will highlight about cost, but I encourage and invite questions if anybody wants to chat more about that construct. So in the next part of the article, or the next part at least that I want to highlight, Dr. Eccles provides a really meaningful and really rich kind of further analysis of the collective identity component of identity more broadly and how it relates to motivated action. And she uses gender identity as an example. So what Dr. Eccles proposes from kind of thinking about collective identity through this motivational lens, and thinking specifically about gender, is because both external socialization, because of external socialization forces and more agentic self-socialization that I talked about earlier, men and women, Dr. Eccles proposes, should develop different expectancies and task values, which should ultimately affect some pretty key educational vocational choices. And she talks about how this happens in several different ways. So an example of how collective identity, in this case in the form of gender, can ultimately lead to different expectancies and task values, which then in turn predicts different educational choices she says that that can happen in different ways, and here are a few different ways that she highlights in the article. For example, different gender role experiences, which leads to different, again, that idea of hierarchies of core and personal values based on one's gender identity. Males and females may have different gender role related experiences, which then leads to different values. You saw in the model how there's that key kind of social experiences box. That's an example of having different experiences based on one's gender role. She then talks about how women and men may differ in their conceptualization of the requirements for successful task participation and completion. In other words, what does it mean to be successful at this task and to complete it successfully? She argues that for a number of reasons, women and men may differ in what they think, how they conceptualize success on a given task or in a given domain. Next, she also talks about how men and women could also differ. I found this point very interesting in the density of their goals and their values. And she highlights research that women seem more likely than men to be involved in and value competence in several different activities simultaneously, whereas according to prior work, men seem to be more likely to zero in on a single goal or a single activity. And then the final point that she highlights by kind of applying collective identity through this SEVT lens and using gender as an example is that gender roles could also affect the subjective value of different educational or vocational options indirectly through influence on different behaviors and attitudes of people that we're all exposed to growing up. So this point really gets to the key role of socializers like parents, peers, and teachers, school counselors, importantly, just to name a few examples of all of the different socializers that can really influence how we ultimately end up making decisions through the expectancies for success that we develop along with our task values. And as Dr. Eccles points out throughout the article, the hierarchical nature of these expectancies and task values. Dr. Eccles then talks about developmental change in the context of collective identity. So a really important takeaway here is that there's so much change that occurs in terms of collective identity, in terms of the salience, the content, and the valence of collective identity. So using the example of gender again, Dr. Eccles talks about how there are some, she doesn't use this language, but this is language that I applied as I was reading through some, seem to be some sensitive periods for particularly pronounced salience of gender roles and collective identity that comes along with that during preschool, again during adolescence, and then again, interestingly, during the family formation and the parenting years. When it comes to collective identity as it relates to gender, gender roles seem to be particularly salient and central for many people, of course not all, during those key sensitive periods of life. And importantly, what the kind of application of developmental change highlights is that it really emphasizes the fluidity of these processes over context, the fluidity and also the dynamic nature of collective identity across contexts. So a few things before I move on to the next part of the recording, a few things that I really want to highlight from her conclusion, because I think that Dr. Eccles did a really excellent job of really reinforcing some key aspects or key tenets of the argument that really grounds this article. In the conclusion, Dr. Eccles stresses the motivational role of personal and collective identities and argued that identities have at least three components. There's this value component that really speaks to the salience, the centrality, and the valence a person attaches to specific both individual characteristics, the me self, and also the collective groups. Then there's the content component, where all of the beliefs, the content component really relates to all of the beliefs that a person has about which tasks, behaviors, etc., are associated with the most successful enactment of these personal and collective identities. And then the efficacy and the expectancy component that we talked about earlier. So I know that this is getting a little bit on the long side. So I'll move now into the details and the features that I really want you to note from this article. Some might seem very peripheral and or micro level. Others might seem broader and more macro level. But again, just things that I want you to notice and to think more about. Because again, I think that this is just such an outstanding article, such a strong example of how to really push theory forward with an article like this, and also to write it in a very accessible way, I think. So a few details that I would like you to note is this article, as I already mentioned, really casts a spotlight on a very influential theory of motivation that we haven't yet talked about in this class, that is often referred to as expectancy value theory, which Eccles and Wigfield renamed very, very recently, 2020. It feels very recent. I guess it was 4 years ago now, but they renamed as situated expectancy value theory. This is a theory of motivation that I think that if any of you are particularly interested in understanding motivational beliefs and how they predict and enact different achievement-related choices, and especially casting a spotlight on how different social identities may play a role in that kind of motivational sequence, this could be a really excellent theory of motivation for you to consider. And also, although I think that SEVT is a theory that can be readily and very effectively applied across the lifespan, I think I see a lot of work focused on the adolescent years. And I think that it is kind of very well suited for that, in addition to other developmental stages as well, really across the lifespan, given especially the developmental nature and emphasis of the model. But wanted to make sure to highlight that this article really casts a spotlight on a new theoretical perspective that we haven't yet talked about in this course. Another thing that I want to highlight is at one point in the article, Dr. Eccles talked about the role of values in motivating or kind of being very closely connected to and predictive of what she referred to as, quote, life-defining choices. This is kind of a big deal. And what I mean by that is what the theory suggests and what a ton of empirical work highlights is that those two components of self-perceptions, especially in the form of task values that I elaborated on quite a bit earlier in the article, they're very closely linked and associated with choices that end up sometimes being quite life-defining, like whether somebody decides to pursue higher education or not, for example, whether they decide to major in physics or fine arts. Those are going to be pretty life-defining choices in some ways, just to name a couple of examples. So I really wanted to kind of cast a spotlight on how powerful the motivational beliefs, which we learned from this article, are intimately tied to identity and different components of identity, how much they really matter in terms of the choices that we ultimately make. Another thing that I want to highlight that I think is such a meaningful and excellent example for us all is particularly when Dr. Eccles talked about her conceptualization of attainment value, how she originally conceptualized it in one way, and now, several decades later in her career, conceptualized it differently, specifically in terms of personal and collective identities. The reason why I really want to highlight that here is because I want to normalize the fact, and I think that this is an excellent example that we see in the article, that ideas and conceptualizations change over time and they change as we learn. And you will see your research interests and your thinking about different constructs and different ideas, you'll see them evolving over time. And so I guess to be super meta developmental about this, we as researchers are also changing over time. We shouldn't be staying static in our thinking necessarily. And so I just think that Dr. Eccles in this article provided a really clear and compelling example of how we think about things, even our own research evolves over time. So I think, again, that kind of not only is a really important thing to note, but perhaps particularly in the context of a developmental course, to remember that we are all developing. It's not just sort of the students or the learners that we're studying. We also are developing over time as researchers as well, and our ideas about key constructs that we're interested in studying are going to evolve along with us. Another thing that I want to highlight that Dr. Eccles said at least once throughout the article when talking about expectancies for success is that positive expectations are necessary, but not sufficient on their own for enacting key behavioral choices. Or not necessarily key behavioral choices, but to put that a little bit different, positive expectations are necessary but not sufficient predictors for making us ultimately land on a given behavioral choice. And I just think that that is so powerful because it can explain a lot about why we end up making one choice over the other. We can be similarly confident in our ability to be successful, but if we don't also attach high value to a given activity or domain or task, then we're going to be a lot less likely to make a choice to pursue a given kind of domain or activity or task. I also want to highlight, even though it wasn't a central theme of this particular article, a couple of times the role of social influencers and socializers and the messages that we receive from those key socializers, like parents, peers, teachers, school counselors, just to name a few examples. And I thought that those ideas and tenets subsumed within the model really reinforce a lot of themes from our discussion from last week on the power of feedback, how important messages are that we receive from key socializers, whether those messages are in the form of task corrective feedback, like was the focus last week, or more implicit, indirect, enduring messages about what we're capable of and what we should or shouldn't be pursuing. Feedback is a really powerful mechanism for ultimately influencing not only our motivational beliefs, but ultimately the choices that we end up pursuing. So I especially, as you all know, I'm a little bit biased. I think that feedback is super interesting and important, and it's one of the things that I focus on in my research program, but especially because that connects really nicely back to what we talked about last week, I wanted to highlight it here. On that note, again, something that I think is so meaningful about situated expectancy value theory that was definitely salient and central, actually, I shouldn't say central, but certainly discussed within this article quite a bit, is again that role of key socializers, parents, peers, teachers, school counselors. And the reason why I wanted to, at the risk of being redundant with my last point about the power of feedback, the reason why I really wanted to cast a spotlight on that feature of the model and Dr. Eccles' discussion of it in this article is because many of you have raised the really valuable comment and question in previous classes about what about the parents? What I hear it actually most often talked about is like, okay, we're talking a lot about what teachers are doing in the classroom, but what about parents? What about peers? What about other key socializers? And something that I think is really powerful about this theoretical perspective is really explicitly acknowledging the power of those other socializers in shaping how individuals think about their own identity, and then the self-perceptions and the behavioral choices that emerge from that. So just, I think a really meaningful and important feature of the model that definitely came up in the article that I wanted to highlight. Okay, those are the only things that I'm going to talk about in terms of key details that I want you to pay attention to and to note. And as usual, I'm going to conclude with a couple of questions for you all to grapple with that we'll hopefully have time to discuss either in class in our own discussion of this article or potentially with Dr. Eccles as well. So a few things that, or a couple things that I want you to think about, and knowing that these questions are meant to really push all of our thinking, and they're not meant to be easy. They're meant, again, for us to really grapple with between now and our class later this week. So the first thing that we want you to think about what are some aspects of your personal and or collective identity, knowing now what you know about the me self and the we self that we talked about in this article, that are especially central to who you are and how you see yourself? And especially given that our focus this week is on adolescent development, what aspects of your personal and collective identity were particularly salient when you were an adolescent? And how have those salient aspects of your personal and collective identity, how have they changed over time across development? Another question that I encourage you all to consider thinking more about between now and our class is that Dr. Eccles, again, returning to her excellent and really in-depth application of how gender serves as a collective identity and its role in motivated behavioral choices, I now want you to think more about how other collective identities, for example, I've heard a lot of you talk about racial and or ethnic identity. I've also heard a lot of you talk about disability. How do you think that those other collective identities, just to name a couple of examples here, shape behavioral choices? Drawing from, again, your own personal experiences and areas of expertise and what you've learned from this article. So I am going to stop the recording now. So grateful to you all, as always, for listening. Can't wait to learn from you. And importantly, can't wait to learn from Dr. Eccles as well in our class later this week. So thanks again. And looking forward to chatting with you later this week.